I'm going to show you two examples of motion, and then I'm going to ask you to think about what these two examples of motion have in common. For the first example of motion, I have a mass hanging from a spring, and the spring is supported at a fixed point up here. I'm going to pull down on the mass, and then you can just watch what the mass and spring do together after I release. For our second example of motion, I have a mass attached to a string, and then that string goes up to the support point. This time, I'm going to pull the mass to the side and release, and we're just going to watch what happens. So that was our second example of motion. Here's my question for you. In which ways is the motion of a mass going up and down at the end of a spring similar to a pendulum motion in which the mass is going back and forth at the end of a string of fixed length? So maybe pause the video, contemplate that a bit, ask yourself in which ways are these two types of motion similar, and once you've contemplated that a bit, rejoin the video. So now I've shown you two examples of different kinds of motion. We have the mass going up and down at the end of the spring. And then we have the pendulum motion where the mass goes back and forth at the end of a string of fixed length. What do these examples of motion have in common? First, both of these are examples of repeated motion. In the example of the mass on the spring, the mass goes up and down, up and down, up and down, over and over. So the motion is repeating itself. In the example of the pendulum motion, the mass goes from left to right, to left, to right, to left, to right, over and over again. Another example of repeated motion. So both of these are examples of repeated motion. What else do these two examples of motion have in common with each other? Both examples of motion are self-sustaining, which is to say, once I initiate the motion, that motion continues over and over without any further intervention from me. So in the example of the mass on the spring, I take the mass, I pull down and release, and that motion repeats itself over and over without any further assistance from me. I just stand there and watch. Similar with the pendulum motion, I pulled the mass to the side and then released, and the mass went back and forth without any further assistance from me. Once the motion was initiated, it just continued. I didn't need to do anything else. So both of these are examples of self-sustaining motion. In physics, we have a term that we use to describe a motion which is repeated and self-sustaining. A self-sustaining repeated motion is referred to as an oscillation. In this module, we're going to be studying oscillation. And in the next few videos, I'm going to begin introducing you to the concepts and mathematics we're going to need to begin to understand oscillation more deeply.